Hello. If you know someone who is nostalgic, or yourself who is nostalgic for 2024 AD, officially, because, well, that's what this year is called, I guess. And if you're watching this either years or maybe even decades in the future, if you're nostalgic for this year, for the year that I'm in currently, well, I'll be in 2025 soon. I don't even know if that will be like whatever. But in my time, where I live, it's being viewed as um, the age of nostalgia. Like, I know every decade has their own version of it. Like, every decade has their own version of nostalgia for that time. Like, what was considered great or pleasurable. Like, every generation and every decade has their own version of things from the past that they like, ever since that was a thing. You know? Like, ever since we as a society made a cultural reset at the early end of every decade, just so that way we can repeat the same thing on the other half, so that way we can have another cultural reset. We've been doing this since the 1890s, but it didn't catch on until, historically at least, with the poor people, until like the 1930s or 40s. Because if you look at it, yeah, it didn't catch on. And now, whichever decade you're in, the decade after, 10 years after that decade ended, whatever decade that will become will stereotype the one before it. And then every generation after that, whatever decade you're from, will be stereotyped generations on and get a more and more modern version to either no longer exist or it's only relevant because of a stereotype. Like, for example, people who get blinded by, say, I don't know, the 1980s. Like, with the people that I know, with everybody that I've seen. Gen X, the generation that grew up during that time, and the 90s as well, because if you're talking about the younger end, obviously it'd be the 90s. But not to the extent of the millennials or whatever, or Generation Y as they call it. But, yeah, this generation invented the saying around 2000, around the year 2000 or 1999, I'm not exactly sure when it happened. I just know that this saying came around right around the turn of the century, just before, you know, oh no, the world is gonna end because new century came in, or whatever. Well, anyway, they developed the saying. Everybody hated the 80s in the 80s. You know why they say that, right? Because back then it was true. Being alive in the 80s during the 80s was like hating today during today. It made sense because, well, you're alive during today, and back then, being in the 80s back then, was that today. Like, it was literally there today. And so because of it, it wasn't like some time movie framed. Like, the only reason why it's still a reference is because your relatives talk about it, and people who lived in it, and all the movies that were from that time and from that era. Like, that is considered the most, like, stereotypical decade era. Second only to the 1950s. Third, I would say the 1960s or 1970s. And fourth, I want to say the 90s. But the weird thing about the 90s is most people, when they talk about the nostalgia for a decade, they usually talk about the later half and then they'll call it the earlier half. Like, when somebody says they're nostalgic for the 90s, what they really mean is they're nostalgic for the year 1999, not the entire decade, or they're nostalgic for a specific year, but they'll call it the whole decade because they'll only remember the good parts of a specific year from that time, or they'll take out all the bad parts because they don't remember much from it, other than the movies or something, or just whatever happened in general. But seriously, a lot of, like, you could say there's a lot of good things from those things that happened, those eras that happened, but If you look at people from like in the 1980s talking about the 1980s, they are just hating on it. They will absolutely hate on it. Like, no matter what you do or what you say, they will just absolutely, I'm watching a video. Sorry about that. They will just hate it. Like, it was just standard of the time. And people kind of do now, but they do it for like the kind of opposite reason. Instead of doing it because people are developing too much new stuff or too whatever, nowadays it's people complaining because people are like, what was considered normal culture for thousands of years is now counterculture or whatever. And because of it, well, at least in my era, people are blinded by nostalgia. Like, we live in an era or the age of nostalgia, as it might be called. That's what I think it would be called. It's a very odd year to be alive, particularly this one, because right now we're in the post-COVID era still, because every decade has its own cultural reset that changes it into the next decade. For the 2010s, it was 2014. You could say 2016, but that's if, like, you know, like, you were, I don't know, say, someone who's like 23 years old, but, well, as of this recording, but, if you're not of that generation, it doesn't make any sense. That generation who grew up with it doesn't make that sense. And why 2016 specifically? Like, I know every generation's got one, but 2016? Really? The year of cringe? The most cringe year of that entire decade? Like, bro, what? But I guess for them, the cringe that they brung, the annoying, weird cringe that they brung is now nostalgic. Or embarrassment, as other people would say, because I don't know if the word cringe will still be relevant in like a couple of decades. But because it does sound like it will last for some time, but it sounds like one of those words I would probably stop saying by like the 2040s or the 2030s, you know? Like, it's just that kind of thing. But anyways, yeah, nostalgia is not quite what it used to be. Like, it used to just be like a small group of people who were nostalgic for a time that they probably didn't even live in, or, well, they did live in, but it was usually like the old folks who were talking about when they were in their late 30s. Because if you don't know, whenever an old person is talking about back in their day, they're usually talking about either their childhood or they're talking about when they were in their late 30s. Because usually, for the average human, when they're going to get the most nostalgia, well, they don't realize it, but when they'll get the most nostalgia for their life, it will most likely be at the age of 36 or 38, because that was when they had, for at least their time, the most happiest memories in their head. When in reality, they were probably a horrible person back then, but who knows? I mean, they're probably a great person now, but back then they were probably having the worst of days, but they only remember all the good parts because, like I said, blinded by nostalgia. Because they lived for so long. But yeah, if you're watching this and you're nostalgic for 2024, which will confuse me. I mean, I could understand if you're watching this, like, say, 30, 40 years in the future from now, or longer, who knows, but, it just doesn't make much sense if you're nostalgic, like how people are. Like, the Gen Z, or someone Gen Alpha, they're nostalgic for years that are still in the decade. Like, for me, it's 2024. There are people in 2024 that are nostalgic for 2022, 2021, 2020. Like, god dang, bro. Anyway, That's about it.
About nostalgia.
Bye.